Hello and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. Today is Friday, May 24th. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today we'll discuss this week's WNBA action, including injuries to Diamond DeShields and Diamond Miller. We'll also highlight our top players to pick up heading into the weekend. And finally, we'll preview this weekend's matchups. Those looking to test RotoWire's full slate of tools can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. And don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you're watching today. You can also feel free to submit questions throughout the show, and we'll answer them during the show or afterward in the comments. This week had plenty of close games, including last night's matchup in which the Sky beat the Liberty. It's even more impressive that Chicago picked up the win without Diamond DeShields, who was unavailable due to a knee injury. Kieran, how concerned are you about DeShields' injury?
Yeah, so she had an MRI on Thursday, which is never a good sign. We don't know the results yet, but I'd expect her to at least miss the weekend, if not longer. If you're going for an MRI, there's probably some pain already there. That like you're like, what's going on with me? So she's probably going to miss at least a couple games, if not longer. You probably don't want to drop her until you get those MRI results, right? But any long-term absence would probably make her unrosterable in like standard leagues unless you have an IR spot. DeShields was putting up strong numbers to start the season, so I don't want to discredit that or anything, but her minutes were being limited. She missed all of last season coming off a knee injury, and she was only playing around 20 minutes per game. So when you couple the fact that she was already limited by the knee injury, now she's dealing with a foot injury. Plus, you got Camila Cardozo, who's about to make her WNBA debut next week. And then you have Isabel Harrison, who could be making her season return sometime soon, too, because she participated in Thursday's morning shoot around. She might still miss a couple games, but, with those two impending returns, plus the fact that Angel Reese and Elizabeth Williams have been playing really well in the front court, DeShields' fantasy value is dropping by the day, even if those MRI results come back and she avoids a serious injury.
Yeah, the Sky are a really interesting team. So they were initially expected to be one of the worst teams in the league, but they've held their own within the first few games of the season, and that's been without some of their players who they expected to be key contributors. So once Cardoso is back, once Isabel Harrison returns, I don't know how the workload will shape out. Even Michaela Onyenwere was really impressive against the Liberty last night. So the Sky have a lot of players who will be able to contribute in real life and help them in terms of real life success. But as we know from a bunch of fantasy sports, sometimes if you have too many productive players, it can hurt uh, fantasy values overall because you don't know who's going to perform well on any given night because they have so many players who are capable of stepping up.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more note about this guy that I saw while scrolling Twitter last night. Angel Reese a rookie is leading the league in offensive rebounds right now, 5 a game. That is just fantastic production. They're getting the Sky are getting production from all sorts of places that we didn't expect, and they're really like competing this year like we didn't think they were.
Yeah, for as much as we talk about the learning curve for rookies in the WNBA, Angel Reese has really performed well from the get-go, and I'm excited to see how she can continue to develop. Diamond Miller also exited Thursday's game against the Sun with a knee injury. She didn't return. Her early season playing time suggested that she was already limited after she had off-season knee surgery, so this injury is kind of concerning to me. Miller is probably one of the players that I'm most concerned about early in the season, regardless of whether she misses any additional games due to this injury. Dorka Juhas appears to be trending toward a return, and even if she comes off the bench, that could limit Miller's role even more going forward. Miller was in the Rookie of the Year conversation at times last season, even though Aaliyah Boston was dominant. There were times when Miller was kind of mentioned in the conversation, and I was hopeful that she would take a step forward in her second year. But whether it's her offseason surgery or Minnesota's offseason acquisitions that are limiting her playing time, and maybe it's both, she simply hasn't been a very reliable fantasy option. It sounds somewhat crazy to say given the preseason expectations, but I'd be okay dropping her at this point. Whenever I'm considering whether to drop a player, I'll look at like, oh, if this player was on the waiver wire in my league, would she be someone that I would snap up? And I don't know that Miller meets that criteria for me at this point. There's no doubt that she has all the talent in the world and she is capable of turning it around at some point. But if the playing time isn't there, then there are probably better fantasy options available out there.
Yeah, 100%. The only way I'm keeping Miller on a roster right now is if I have 7 or 8 players that are top 50, right? Or top 45, and I can just plug and play them and get enough production. But if you need a spot on your roster to make moves and do those sorts of things, like Miller is definitely worthy of dropping to add, to add a spot to stream different players every day, so you get an extra player. Like you said, the rookie of the year conversation last year, really thought she was going to be a up and coming player for a Lynx team that kind of needed like a boost off the bench, but it just hasn't happened yet. And I don't think either of us are saying that can't happen eventually towards the end of the season, but right now the risk reward of like stashing her is just not there.
Yeah, she feels a little bit more like a streaming candidate at this point, as opposed to like a season one option, because of all of the talent that Minnesota has brought in during the offseason.
I wouldn't, yeah, like 100%. Like maybe she could turn into a streaming option, but like right now, like even if I had a spot, like I wouldn't want to pick her up because she's only going to play 15 minutes, even if she's healthy. So it's a really tough situation for Diamond Miller right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are also plenty of players who have surprised and stepped up over the first week and a half of the regular season, and they weren't picking up in WNBA fantasy leagues. Let's highlight a few who are under rostered at this point in the season. So starting out in Los Angeles, I've been really impressed with Kia Nurse. She saw her role decline with the Storm last season, but she's bounced back to begin her time with the Sparks. She started in the first 3 games of the year and has scored in double figures in every matchup while averaging 11 field goal attempts per game. She isn't stellar in secondary categories, but she does just enough to prop up her fantasy value and makes her at least a viable streaming option at this point. We've talked for weeks about the Sparks' young talent that includes Cameron Brink and Rakia Jackson, and the team will get Azrae Stevens back at some point. So I'm not sure whether Nurse will be reliable on a season-long basis, but there's a lot of value in WNBA fantasy and streaming options that you can feel comfortable dropping and trying to add later in the week. We talked about this a little bit earlier this week, but sometimes it can be good to have one of those players who you see as just a pure streaming option at the end of your bench so that you're able to make those daily roster moves and get an extra player in your lineup. Where if you have so many elite talents, then it can be tough if your players don't have a bunch of games that week, then you might be in danger of losing to your opponent. Granted, I would still much rather have a roster full of like elite players, but it can be good to have a player that you feel comfortable dropping as well.
Yeah. Roster flexibility is always a huge thing in fantasy for sure. But there's, and with the W, with, maybe not every player in your league is like watching it as closely as they can. If you are, then you can take advantage of those types of situations for sure. My only note on Kia Nurse is she's one of 3 players for the Sparks who's played at least 30 minutes in every game. So like if she's available on your waiver, you got to snatch that up. Like there's not many players on the waivers are averaging over 30 minutes a game. And even if, like you said, some of her secondary stats aren't there, when you're playing 30 minutes, like we've talked about before, those numbers will come. My first player that I want to highlight for this week, I feel like we talked about her a little bit last week or on Monday as like a potential pickup, but Julie Vanloo, a 31-year-old rookie guard for the Mystics, has really stepped up in the absence of Brittany Sykes, who's dealing with an injury and has missed the last couple games. Vanloo has started 3 straight games in Sykes' absence, but she's played at least 24 minutes in 4 straight. During that stretch, she's averaging 11 points, 6.5 assists, 4 rebounds. So like that's pretty solid production. She's shooting 40.7% from deep on 6.8 attempts per game, strong, and has made 9 of her last 18 attempts. So she's really probably on a hot streak right now, which is increasing some of her points production. But even if that points production drops, she's up there. Not, I wouldn't say leading the league in assists. She's not close to that, but she's close to that, like top 10 in assists. Washington was initially optimistic about Sykes' return timetable. She traveled with the team during their current three-game road trip, but it's unclear when Sykes will be available again and if she'll be able to play a full workload when she's initially cleared. Vanloo should be considered a short-term pickup, right? But she needs to be rostered in all leagues right now. Like, she currently has more fantasy points than players like Deanna Taurasi, Kelsey Plum, Kelsey Mitchell, DeShields Carrington. Like, these are strong fantasy players that we've talked about for times. And obviously, like, it's early in the season, so she's played a couple more games than some of those players. But my point is the production is there, and the production will continue as long as Sykes is out.
Yeah, and like you said, Vanloo's production has been bolstered by the Brittany Sykes injury, and hopefully she's back sooner rather than later. But Vanloo's passing abilities have been on full display. She's currently tied for 5th in the league in assists. But if you look at the players around her, it's Jackie Young, Alyssa Thomas, Natasha Cloud, Courtney Williams, Sabrina Ionescu, Marina Mabry, and Julie Vanloo. And then Caitlin Clark is right below her. So if you put Julie Vanloo among those names early in the season and we're like, do you want to have a shot at a player with this kind of assist potential? I think the answer would be absolutely yes. Even during the regular season opener, when Sykes was fully available, Vanloo still put up 11 ESPN fantasy points because of her scoring and assists ability. So I think that even when Sykes is back in action, there's still the chance that Vanloo will be able to put together some serviceable production for your team. Moving on to the Fever, Temi Fagbenle has been a very bright spot early in the season. She's come off the bench in all 5 appearances, but she's posted double-digit ESPN fantasy points in each game, and she posted a double-double Monday against Connecticut. Aaliyah Boston has had a somewhat slow start to the season, along with a lot of the rest of the Fever. And it's unclear whether Fagbenle's role will decline when Boston finds her groove. But even when Fagbenle has been quiet on the scoreboard, she's productive on the defensive side of the ball and seems to have carved out consistent playing time for now. So the Fever, as much preseason hype as they got, they're still a young team that's still sort of in the middle of a rebuild. So if Fagbenle can carve out her role, then I think that she has real potential to be a solid contributor.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like going into the season, we probably thought that there wasn't going to be much fantasy value to be had behind Aaliyah Boston and Alyssa Smith, right? Like, probably those two are going to be playing over 30 minutes and dominating the production. Whoever's coming off the bench is going to play, 8 to 12 minutes or whatever, which isn't very fantasy viable. But Temi's played at least 19 minutes in 4 straight. She's played at least 23 minutes in back-to-back games and 27 in the game. I think it was last night or 2 nights ago. And she played 27 minutes and Aaliyah Boston only played 15. So the production is there. And like you said, it might not continue. And she's also a great 30, like per 36 minutes or per minute production is there too. Even if she's not getting over 25 minutes, even if she's stuck at around the 20-minute range, she can be a great streaming option or even like a consistent starter in fantasy rotation for sure. Sticking with the front court, I'm moving over to Phoenix. Another kind of surprise player, Natasha Mack, center for Phoenix, has been phenomenal in the absence of Brittany Griner, who's out indefinitely with the toe fracture. Mack isn't going to score much, but she's averaging 8.3 rebounds, 3.8 assists, 2.3 blocks, and nearly a steal per game over her 4 appearances this season, which are all starts in place of Griner. As long as Griner's out and Mack is putting up solid rebounding and defensive numbers, Mack will be a consistent high floor option for fantasy managers in need of front court production. And like we've talked about early this season, it's hard. Front court production is hard to come by. There's a lot of guards that can shine occasionally, but the front court production is sporadic. I do think Mack's fantasy upside is limited given her lack of scoring. I don't think she's going to have many 40-point fantasy games, right? But I'll take 20 points, 20 to 25 points every night with 8 rebounds and a couple of blocks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't know exactly when Brittany Griner will be back. Hopefully, it's sooner rather than later. But having the starting center for Phoenix, there's something to be said about that. And she's been a really consistent ESPN fantasy player early in the season. Uh, Her rebounding ability is great, especially like on a team with a bunch of guards who like to shoot, like Diana Taurasi, Kalia Copper. There should be rebounds to be had, and her blocking, she's had at least 2 blocks in every game. So when a player can be consistent on the defensive side of the ball is when they really start to be a solid ESPN fantasy player, because steals are worth 2 points and blocks are worth 2 points. So if you can do that, you'll be well on your way to success. And Natasha Mack has been, like you said, she'll probably like drop off the radar once Brittany Griner is back. But I mean, even if she can maintain maybe like 10 to 15 minutes off the bench, I think she would at least warrant some streaming consideration later on as well. Um, Monique Billings was a player who was surprisingly cut by the Sparks before the season, and she's only on a hardship contract with the Wings. But she took on a starting role Tuesday against Atlanta and posted a double double. She's a player who definitely deserves to be on a WNBA roster, so it was pretty surprising to see her cut before the regular season. Natasha Howard still appears to be on track to miss several more weeks, so Billings should remain a solid contributor for the Wings. Tiara McCowan came off the bench Tuesday, so it's not yet clear whether Billings will continue to handle a starting role. But Billings is a decent scorer with solid rebounding abilities, which makes her worthy of fantasy considerations for as long as she's on the court for the Wings. Uh, it wouldn't surprise me, even if her contract would expire with the Wings at some point, if she's able to re up with Dallas or find a role elsewhere. So I think that she's a player who should be able to handle a roster spot somewhere. So it would be really nice to add her just in case she can provide that season long value for you.
Yeah, Dallas is in a weird spot with all of the injuries, right? And in their second game of the season, in the front court, they started McCowan, Maddie Siegrist, and Stephanie Soares. But then in their next contest, they benched McCowan and Siegrist and Soares. Or no, Soares started. They benched Siegrist and McCowan, and Billings and Kalani Brown came in. But then Brown only played like 7 minutes, and Soares only played like 14 minutes. And it ended up being McCowan's who played a bunch of minutes off the bench anyways. Going forward, we haven't really talked about this, but going forward, I would assume it's going to be McCowan, Billings, and Siegrist, maybe Siegrist or Soares. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out going forward. I know I just said a bunch of names going back and forth, and I'm even a little bit confused. So that just kind of puts you into perspective of like what's going on in Dallas. So we aren't really sure, but I feel very confident in saying that McCowan and Billings are probably the two best fantasy options to have in Dallas's front court. I don't know if you would agree with that. We haven't really talked about it off air, so I'm sorry for just like throwing that at you, but I feel like
No,
that's probably the right way to go.
yeah. So even with McCowan coming off the bench, she posted, I believe, a double double. So
Yeah.
I'm not worried about her regardless of her role. Stephanie Suarez, in their loss to the Sky, posted 9 rebounds and 4 blocks. So that was some solid ESPN fantasy production. But during Tuesday's loss to Atlanta, she was held to 1 rebound and 1 assist. So it seems like she'll be very inconsistent. So if you even gave me the choice between Suarez and Maddie Siegrist, I would probably prefer Siegrist at this point. I've also been a little bit disappointed with Kalani Brown's performance. She was in the starting lineup Tuesday, but only had 2 rebounds. So I think that at this point, I'm sticking to McCowan and Siegrist in the front court. Oh, and Monique Billings.
Yeah. The funny thing, Brown got moved into the starting lineup, but then played fewer minutes than she did the 2 previous games when she came off the bench. I'm not really sure what's going on. It's confusing, but like we said, McCowan, Billings, Siegrist are probably in that order, and then Suarez and Kalani Brown after her. Sticking in Dallas, but moving to the backcourt, Sevgi Uzun needs to be rostered everywhere, right? She's Dallas's starting point guard for the foreseeable future. She started all 3 games. She played 27 minutes, 29 minutes, and then 35 minutes. And she's struggled to find her shooting strokes thus far. She's shooting only 39% from the field, but is averaging 5.7 assists. So just right in that Julie Vanloo area, almost like right around the top 10, and 1 point steals per game. We don't know when Jaylen Brown could come back. She had surgery on a broken nose and was expected to be reevaluated in a week, which would be coming soon, but she still might miss a couple games. Like you mentioned, Natasha Howard, Satu Sabali both remain out. So Uzun has a clear path to 30 minutes and should continue to put up great assist numbers. Even if her shooting efficiency doesn't improve, Uzun's distributing should give her fantasy relevancy and a pretty decent fantasy floor for the next couple weeks.
Yeah, and I was a little bit skeptical of Uzun during the regular season opener because even though she started, she had 6 points, 3 assists, and a block. So, as someone who hadn't played in the WNBA before, I was thinking that those were more ceiling numbers. So, if that would have been the case, she was more of a player that I was keeping off of my radar, but she's improved over the last few games, especially as a passer. So if she can continue her passing abilities and steal and defensive abilities, I think that she has the potential to be a really consistent option. Jordan Horston from the Storm has also been slightly inconsistent, but she's been a solid contributor, especially on the defensive end. Despite coming off the bench in every game, she's logged at least 1 steal in each appearance and has tallied 5 blocks through 5 matchups. I don't expect her to be consistent in blocks, but she averaged 1.2 steals per game last year and has shown promise in the scoring and rebounding columns. Victoria Vivians has taken on a starting role for Seattle, but hasn't been as productive as Horston. Even if Horston continues to come off the bench, it's impressive to see her carving out consistent minutes on a new super team in the league. I had expected going into the season that Horston would take on that final spot, either Horston or Sammy Whitcomb. But even with Horston coming off the bench, she's averaged 23.4 minutes per game, which is up from last year when she started 17 matchups. So I think that the potential for Horston is there. And even if she does have some inconsistent performances like she had during Monday's loss to the Liberty, where she was limited to 8 ESPN fantasy points, like if she can go over 20 ESPN points on a consistent basis, then I really like her as a streaming option or even just someone to keep on your roster. I think that she has a lot of versatile potential for fantasy managers.
Yeah, I think one of the first shows that we did, I talked about Victoria Vivians being a surprise starter during the preseason, and that Horston or Whitcomb would eventually take over that spot. But it looks like even if they don't take over, or even if Horston doesn't take over that spot, she can still be a solid fantasy contributor off the bench. And I like her all-around game a lot. So my final player, and the final player that we'll be highlighting today, is Tiffany Mitchell. Veteran in the W, right? Coming over to a new team for the first playing in Connecticut, weren't really sure what to expect. I don't know if this is as much of a like you should go and pick her up right now as much as it is like you should have her on your radar. She played 26 minutes off the bench on Thursday at the expense of DeShields Carrington, who wasn't dealing with foul trouble, was a little inefficient, had a couple turnovers, but wasn't like playing horrible. It just looked like Mitchell was the player that was going to be run out there and given the matchup. Mitchell has been a productive player throughout her career, but her role to start her first season in Connecticut was super limited. And that probably made her droppable by a lot of players. So she's probably on the waiver in most, if not all leagues. If she can maintain that top backup guard spot in Connecticut ahead of Rachel Banham and Mariah Jefferson, Mitchell could have fantasy value, maybe not like this weekend, but in like the coming weeks. Especially when you consider that like Carrington and Tasha Harris, who have both had really strong starts to the season, don't have like a long track record of above average production, right? So you might see some negative regression from the starting backcourt in Connecticut, which would mean that a player like Mitchell could have a clear path to like increased production, increased usage in the coming weeks.
Yeah, Mitchell is someone who I'm probably not making a priority to add at this point, at least for like someone who I'm looking to keep on my roster. But after Thursday's performance, she showed a lot of promise, and if she can have some more performances like that, she's someone who, like we talked about with streaming candidates, if you have a player that you're willing to drop, and even if Tiffany Mitchell is the best player available, I think that she's worth adding just in case you can get those extra points in your matchup, just to uh, put yourself a little bit ahead of the pack. So to close out the show, let's talk about some of the matchups we're looking forward to seeing this weekend. On Monday, we talked about the Sky and Liberty having an intriguing matchup, and it didn't disappoint with the Sky taking down New York. We have just one game tonight, followed by 5 games tomorrow and 2 matchups Sunday. Kirian, which games are you most looking forward to watching?
Obviously, a ton of action going on Saturday that'll be interesting. And we highlighted on Monday's show how much I was looking forward to Caitlin Clark going against the Aces and seeing how she would handle that matchup. But it might as well not get ahead of ourselves, right? We got number 1 versus number 2 overall picks in this last year's draft tonight, Friday. Caitlin Clark versus Cameron Brink is much watched TV for all hoops fans, in my opinion. Brink has drawn some comparisons to Anthony Davis, and you can see why whenever you tune in to watch her. She had a pair of game-sealing blocks against Washington on Tuesday. She's the real deal defensively. It might take some while for her offensive game to catch up, but promising young start to her career. And then on the other side, everyone is saying Clark is struggling, and I suppose that's true given her turnovers and some of the foul trouble she's dealt with. But if this is a bad version of Clark, the good version may be the best player that we've ever seen in the W, right? Granted, the Fever have played more games than any other team so far, but Clark is currently has scored the third most fantasy points, trailing only Brianna Stewart and Jewel Lloyd, ESPN fantasy points, that is. So, like, if this is the bad version of Clark, I'm excited to see when she puts it all together. I've read some articles and stuff and some think pieces that are like, in college, Clark was kind of like that, that smack talking, staring at the bench, like, and so far in the W, like she's chirped at the refs a little bit, but it hasn't been like about me yet. So I'm curious to see when she will like harness that energy and start taking over the league. Like at least I expected her to.
Yeah, even though it is a learning curve for the rookies coming into the W, it's really encouraging when we're able to see this year's top of the rookie class like stand out by doing what they do best. So Cameron Brink has had a few moments where she's looked a little bit out of place, but whenever she's underneath the basket defending, she is a force to be reckoned with. And whenever you see her just like swatting away the shots, it gives you hope for the rest of her career. And same with Caitlin Clark. Whenever she's able to get those open looks from three and drain them, it's really encouraging to see that happen. So I think that both of them have bright futures ahead of them, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do tonight facing off against each other, especially with the Fever. So this will be the first matchup for the Fever that isn't against Connecticut, New York, or Seattle. Indiana played Connecticut and Seattle really close in both of their last 2 games. So I think that this is a spot where Indiana could get the excuse me, the Fever could get their first win of the season. The Sparks have also looked really impressive early in the year, but I think that even on the road, that the Fever could uh, wind up taking down LA. I'm also really looking forward to seeing the Sky take on the Sun. So we talked about with the Sky and the Liberty on Thursday how it was a chance for the Sky to really prove as to whether their success against Dallas was able to be translated to other opponents. And I think that Chicago proved that the answer was yes last night. The Sky have played well to begin the season, even without Camila Cardoso and Isabel Harrison. It'll be the home opener for the Sky, who showed that really they shouldn't be counted out of any matchup this year. The Sky's lone loss this season came during their season opener, and they really appeared to be in control for most of that matchup against Dallas before the Wings pulled away in the closing minutes. The undefeated Sun are going to pose another challenge, especially given their dominant front court. We already know that Chicago will remain without Cardoso, who will be out until June 1st, and it's unclear whether Harrison will be able to play. If Harrison and Diamond DeShields remain out Saturday, then Angel Reese, Elizabeth Williams, and Michaela Onienwere are going to have their hands really full against players like Alyssa Thomas, Brianna Jones, DeWanna Bonner. But I think that they've proved early on that they are competitive, and especially if Reese is able to continue developing, like I'm really excited to see what this team can do against some of the league's premier teams.
For sure. I'm looking and then going to Saturday, I'm really looking forward to that Lynx Liberty matchup, first game of the afternoon. Should be fantastic. I have a lot of futures on Minnesota being successful this year, which they have been so far, but they're going to face a tough test against the Liberty team that we mentioned is coming off a disappointing loss to the Sky and will probably be bringing their A game. Collier versus Stewish is an early MVP candidate battle and should be competitive from the jump. So that's probably my favorite game of Saturday slate.
Yeah, Collier and Stewart have both looked great lately, so I'm excited to see the star power in this game and see if the Lynx can continue their early season success. It should be an entertaining weekend for sure. That does it for our Friday show. We'll be off this Monday while observing Memorial Day, but we'll be back Tuesday at 1 p.m. Central to preview next week's action. We'll see you then.